I want to talk a little bit about what I call EAD theory. That name could probably use some work, but for now I'm just going to call it EAD because it stands for Experience, Actions, Data. And I want to talk about particularly the experience and action part of that. And it's basically my framework for approaching game design from a perspective of what the player is supposed to actually do. So I want to talk about experience first, and it's basically about defining what the player experiences. And this is where you'll see like everything that goes into a one pager pretty much, like all of the experiential targets, emotional targets, experiential pillars and emotional pillars and all that stuff would be pretty much your experience. And that needs to be really well defined in terms of how the player is supposed to feel and why they're supposed to feel that way. And you just try to be as specific as possible, and you can use MDA theory to help you out with that, using aesthetics as a good sort of shared language, and MDA is a good framework for doing that. But I want to take another step, which is to talk about the actions that you take. For the most part, psychology pretty much works in two directions. One is I feel something, and therefore I act as a response to that feeling. The second is I feel a certain way as a response to an action I've taken. And that isn't just I did a thing and there are consequences and I feel a certain way about the consequences. It also just reflects your emotional state. So there are a bunch of studies about like if you smile a lot, you'll be happier, and they found that that's not just because if you're happier, you smile a lot. They found that smiling actually makes you more happy. Now you can take that and extrapolate it to pretty much any human action, and this is the fundamental focus of EAD theory from the perspective of actions. So the idea is to have such a clear understanding of what the player is supposed to feel and experience that you can then start to figure out what kinds of actions would make them feel that way. Now, I define this not only as the actions that make you feel a certain way, it's the actions that a player would take if they feel a certain way, or the actions that would make you feel a certain way. So it's both of those things that fall into the actions category. And a player action is generally something more along the lines of I want the player to go this way, right? Like if you think about like the mother of all examples for level design of Half-Life, where you have these corridors that don't really lead anywhere, they just lead to dead ends, but because of the way it's lit, it makes you feel more like you want to go towards that way, and then you always have this part of the level that's in the back of your mind that seems like it would have been a place, but really isn't. And it makes the levels feel a lot bigger than they actually are. So the experience would be we want players to think that the space that they're in is larger than it actually is, because that way it'll feel more like an expansive world. And the action that they've decided on, and you can do multiple actions per experience, definitely. In fact, generally you want that. This is just a really quick example. The action that they've decided on is to say, okay, well, we want the action that you take to be that you walk to a fork. There's some kind of fork in the road. One leads one way and one leads the other way. One leads to the rest of the level and is actually the way that you're supposed to go, the way that you would go to progress. And the other leads to a dead end pretty quickly. And you want the player to be taking the action of not going to the dead end as much as possible. So that's the player action, and it's one of the actions that would contribute to the experience. The last step is data, and this is actually all just about playtesting, because then you take the action, which is much clearer in terms of what the data might look like than an experience would ever be. So you would take something like the example that we just used about the Half-Life levels, where okay, we want the player to not go towards the dead end, but you can't guarantee that players aren't going towards the dead end 100% of the time. What you can do is have a certain target for how often you want them to avoid the dead end. Like maybe 10% of the time is acceptable. And you'd have to do a lot of testing for that to see if that's the right value for you. But it's a good place to start. And you can go, okay, let's say we want to see the players not go to the dead end about 10% of the time. Now you can do play tests and start gathering real data on what that actually, on how that actually works out. And that's really, really valuable because you can compare that with the feedback that you get from questionnaires or forums or other feedback and you get way more information than you would have with either of those things alone. So that's my introduction to my EAD framework for game design. It's obviously a lot more complex than that, and doing it is easier than giving a quick overview of it, but that's basically how it works and why I think it's valuable, because not only does it make the design problems more clear as you go, well, we want to create this experience, and we want to create this experience by creating these player actions. Let's design a system that creates these player actions. It also helps you build the data that makes playtesting more valuable and more effective. And that altogether makes for a much more effective approach to designing systems or finding out whether the systems you designed worked and testing your process. And that's really what it's all about, is making sure that your process is working and that everything works together nicely in your game. So that's EAD theory. I hope this has been interesting. If you want to hear more about it, let me know, and I will consider putting together something more expansive. Thanks for listening.